Ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to take your seats, we're about to get started. Well, good evening. My name is Jason Rea. I am the new Chief Learning Officer at Founding Forward. I'm sure that most of you have heard over the last 3+ months about the merger that has taken place between Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge and the Union League Legacy Foundation. It has been my privilege for the last 17 years to have been at that other place in Valley Forge, and now to be with Founding Forward. Luckily enough, I have had the opportunity over those many years to work with the amazing team, John Miko, Kira Foley-Tusman, and the rest of the Founding Forward team. And now we are all together. We are a national 501c3 charity dedicated to educating individuals and empowering them to participate and uphold our system of self-government. And it is only possible, the work that we do, both things like this speaker series, as well as the programs we do for students and teachers, both here in the League House and out at the 75-acre campus in Valley Forge. The only way that is possible is because of the support of individuals like you. And I know that my good friends and colleagues, Dr. Gary Dorsheimer and Kristen Moran are here if anybody would like to know how they can support Founding Forward and the work that we are doing. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. You know this because all of you have, I'm sure most of you have been here before. John Miko says it all the time. We are going to have Q&A at the end. We're going to go around with microphones. And if you are more than a couple of sentences and can't end with a question mark, you have failed. Please be thinking about what you might want to ask and make sure we want to get as many questions in as possible. Two quick commercials for May programs. May 6th, we are going to have Dr. William Allen, who has recently done a new translation of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, and he will be coming to speak about that. He is also, we just learned last week, the 2024 Bradley Prize winner, and we are very excited to have him here talking about the Enlightenment, Montesquieu, and the American Revolution. And then at the end of the month, on May 30th, we will have Greg Lukianoff from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, who will be here to talk about cancel culture. So please, we'd love to see you back for both of those programs. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce one of our volunteer leaders at Founding Forward from our board of directors, and also my boss, because he is the chair of the Education Committee, Mr. Steve Targett.
I'm just happy that I followed the recommendations and wore the solar eclipse glasses, because I think I can still read. Tonight's Civil War Roundtable speaker, David Thomson, is an associate professor of history and chairman of the history department at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. Professor Thomson earned his PhD in history from the University of Georgia, where his scholarly focus was the history of capitalism, particularly during the Civil War. His recent book, Bonds of War: How Civil War Financial Agents Sold the War on the Union, explores how the Union effort was financed, drawing on archives in a dozen states and 9 different countries. He's also the author of We Are in His Hands, Whether We Live or Die, the letters of Brevet Brigadier General Charles Henry Howard. His work has also appeared in the Journal of the Civil War Era, New York Times, Washington Post, Bloomberg, and the Boston Globe, and the Sunday Magazine. Boston Globe Sunday Magazine, excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor David Thomson to the Union League's Civil War Roundtable.
Good evening, everybody. Can we hear me okay? Okay, perfect. It's always where I like to start. It is such a thrill and honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction, Steve. Kira was kind enough to remind me that this is a delayed engagement. I was supposed to be here in September of 2022. I, not being a wise man, agreed to do this the week before my wedding. And my wife kindly reminded me of that engagement, and so we had to regrettably postpone. So still married, and so thrilled to be here, if I'm being honest. I was doing a little bit of math earlier, and I could be off by a couple, but I think this might be the 43rd book talk that I've given, and perhaps the one I'm most excited for because of not just you all wonderful people here, but because of the deep connections to Philadelphia within the work itself, and in particular, Jay Cooke, who is a member at least of this fine organization back in the 1860s, although not a founding member despite some of his claims later in life, all right? And so with that, I'd like to get us started here. And I always like to start with this image, because when I look at this image, I actually see dollar signs. I see money. These are all the various instruments of war. I apologize for the quality. It's the 1860s. Photography is still in its infancy, so that's always something to be mindful of. But when you look here, you can see there are soldiers, there are horses, if you look close enough, there are cannons, there are cannonballs, there are muskets, there are ships. All of this costs money. The American Civil War, a war that took the lives of 750,000 Americans, approximately 2.5% of the population. At the time, it cost $3.2 billion. If we were to make that the equivalent today, it's about $6.7 trillion. All right? It's a very, very expensive war, the likes of which the United States has never seen, and frankly, the Western world had not seen. Of that $3.2 billion, about 3/4 of it, $2.23 billion, is going to be financed through bonds. The rest is through things like taxation, limited amount of taxation at the time, as well as printing currency. But war bonds are not particularly something that we associate with the Civil War. It's something that we talk a lot about with World War I and World War II and the war bond drives, and there's a Cooke connection there as well, as we'll get to here at the end. But this war is largely financed through these bonds, 32 different types of bonds, financial instruments issued during the war. Rest assured, we are not going to go through all 32 of them, but I am going to share a couple of them with you tonight. Because what bonds of war really gets at is looking at the distinctive role of Union bonds in financing this war, and not only global finance, but also state development for this time period. Jay Cooke, who we'll come to talk more about, and his network of financial surrogates, I guess we could say, transformed the bond market landscape in the United States. Fundamentally, this book is really in part a book about marketing. How do you sell a war to the public? How do you sell bonds to a public that has very little familiarity with that type of financial instrument? How do you convince people to buy these? Forgive me, I'm taking my watch off so that I can actually see it, because I am well aware that I need to stick to time and I can get a little excited talking about this. What drew me to this project, somebody asked me as I was signing a book. It was by happenstance. My father is a retired economist. My brother is a current economist. I vowed to do nothing whatsoever associated with economics or finance. And yet here I am. And I started to dig into an archive thinking I was going to be researching an entirely different topic, and came across references to bonds. And the reality is, at the time of the Civil War, they thought that there'd be all sorts of books written about finance and the Civil War. I won't kill you with quotes, I promise. There's just a couple of them here. But when the history of this war comes to be written, no part of it will attract more attention or command more admiration than the chapters which relate to finance. Clearly, no one ever thought about the Battle of Gettysburg, because there are no shortage when it comes to, say, Gettysburg or various generals from the war, but very little when it comes to actually talking about how the war was financed, how the war was simply paid for on a very basic level. This is one of the about half dozen surviving Civil War bonds that still exist today. Most of them, because of the fact that the United States government won the war, were turned in, redeemed, and were properly destroyed by the federal government. So you can go on eBay and buy a Confederate bond if you want, no problem. But there are very few that are left, which is a real shame because I'm also looking at this from like a material culture standpoint and kind of what's the imagery that they're using for these bonds. But this is one of those various bonds that, of those 32 different issues. But fundamentally, the story is also about the people. There are a tremendous amount of fantastic, and I really do mean fantastic characters when it comes to looking at Civil War finance. The Confederates recognized it as such. One Confederate at the end of the war said, "The Yankees did not whip us on the field. We were whipped in the Treasury Department." In their minds, it was the financing of the war and the successful financing of the war by the federal government and a huge role of Jay Cooke here in Philadelphia and his various financial soldiers who are essentially traveling salesmen, thousands of them in number, who sold the war. They sold, in essence, confidence. They sold a commitment to union, to the Union Army and to the Union way of life. And they were successfully able to get millions of people at a time when the northern population is about 22 million people, just for a frame of reference. They were able to convince millions of people to purchase these bonds, and in doing so, fund this war. And it's a wide assortment of characters. I'm going to skip one block quote. It's a wide assortment of characters, men, women, immigrants, former slaves, all purchasing these bonds. And in a way, they're able to do so because of how Jay Cooke and his network convinced them not only to buy them, but set them up, finance plans, things like that, so people can actually afford to buy these things, which is no small part of this equation. When we talk about the Civil War, you have to talk about, in Civil War finance, you must talk about this man right here. This is Salmon P. Chase, first Secretary of the Treasury under Abraham Lincoln, a man who has zero background in finance. He is an anti-slavery lawyer. Lincoln brings him in. Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about it in Team of Rivals, right? This is a threat. And so best to keep your threats very close. And so he makes Chase Secretary of the Treasury. Chase does not endear himself to the financiers of places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston, which are the three most important markets that he has to coordinate with. He goes to New York at one point at the beginning of the war and says, "If you're not willing to buy the bonds, I will print money until it costs $1,000 to buy breakfast," and then storms out of the room. Goes back to DC. There are actually bankers from New York on his train back to DC so that they can meet with Lincoln and say, "Who is this guy, this clown, that you have made Secretary of the Treasury? He doesn't know what he's doing." Chase, to his credit, is going to try to at least finance the Civil War the way that previous wars have been financed for the United States. The War of 1812, the Revolutionary War to a certain extent, and the Mexican-American War, which is issuing bonds, but really just relying on wealthy financiers in places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, who might then sell them on to clients. But the idea of kind of a widespread democratic, right, bond issuance to the people, that's a foreign concept, all right? That's not something that Chase is going to try to do. The first year of the war does not go well for the United States government. Disastrous defeats at places like Bull Run lead to a financial crisis. By December of 1861, there's going to be a suspension of specie payment in this country. You cannot redeem your notes for gold or silver. Congress is going to step in. They're going to attempt to step in and kind of fill this void with something called the Legal Tender Act. They create a national currency, the greenback as they are known, because the backs of them were green. Nothing more complicated than that. But as part of that Legal Tender Act, which issued $150 million worth of currency, they're also going to put out a $500 million bond issue. These are bonds that are perhaps the most famous bond issue of the war. I'm going to come back to Mr. Cooke in one second. This is one of them right here. It's the cover of my book as well, shameless plug. The colors are the exact same. It's known as the 520 bond issue. It's a $500 million issue. They're called 520 bonds because the government can call them in after 5 years and they mature within 20 years. They have a 6% interest rate on them. And as you can see on the bottom here, these are coupon bonds, meaning that you would literally had perforated coupons that you would actually have to physically turn in twice a year, May and November, to the federal government or one of their agents. But they can't actually sell these things. No one wants to buy them. Financiers are willing to only commit so much. They're hedging their bets. What if the United States government loses? And then they end up with this pile of a frankly worthless paper. And it's into that kind of breach, that void, that Jay Cooke is going to step in. All right? So Jay Cooke, Ohio-born, Sandusky, Ohio, but by the time of the Civil War is based here in Philadelphia. His office is on South 3rd Street. He opens his own bank in 1859. All right, so it's not like he's some long-established financial player. People in New York City, frankly, have no idea who this guy is. But Cooke has a vision. Cooke wants to sell these bonds to the masses. It's not something that he's created, right? This is following on things like the French have done under Napoleon. The Austrians do this in the 1850s. Cooke's a student of history, right? So he's borrowing from others. And he says, I think there's a way that we can do this in the United States too. I think I can convince Americans to buy these bonds. And he's got the ear of the Secretary of the Treasury because Chase is from Ohio, Cooke is from Ohio. Jay Cooke's brother, Henry Cooke, was one of the largest newspaper editors in Ohio when Chase was governor of Ohio. And so ultimately, the Secretary of the Treasury agrees to bring on Jay Cooke as his exclusive agent for the federal government to sell these bonds. His commission is going to be 0.3%. And he absorbs personally all marketing costs. All right, this is not someone who is making a lot of money by doing this for this first issue. All right, it's a $500 million issue. So how do we sell these to people? How do you convince people it's okay to make money when the rest of the language that they are hearing is about things like sacrifice? Have your husband go fight. Have your children go fight. Donate socks to the war effort. Oh, by the way, go buy a bond and, with interest, you're going to make a little bit of money on it, right? He has to try to kind of circle that square a little bit and convince people that it's okay it's patriotic to pursue profit, even if it's a very small amount. Okay, so there's the messaging component, which Cooke does in-house here in Philadelphia for this entire bond issue. Eventually, he hires some PR folks up in New York, right? But initially, he does it all here, in-house. Then you got to figure out structurally, how are you going to convince people to buy these? How are you going to make them physically able to buy them? Well, we're going to create bonds that are as small as $50. And we're going to give you 9 months to actually essentially purchase the bond. Payment plans, installment plans, so that people can afford it. $50 is still a lot of money in the 1860s, particularly if you're looking at kind of working class individuals that you want to target to buy these bonds, which is exactly what Cooke does. And then Cooke really just goes full throttle when it comes to his marketing. One of my favorites, it's all Pennsylvania tied in. He creates a fake, it's totally fake, a fake Q&A with a Berks County farmer, right? And the questions are like, I am a simple farmer. I know not of you big city folk and what you do. What is a bond? What is interest, right? And he's like, well, Farmer John, a bond is, right? And it's over the top, but that's the point, right? He's trying to really drive it home to these individuals, what a bond is, make it accessible, right, to the financially relatively illiterate, right? Even savings accounts are only kind of picking up in the 1850s for a lot of folks. So it's not like there's a lot of financial literacy here, but he's going to use kind of this marketing to try and sell the bonds. And sell them he does. It becomes a wild success ultimately for Cooke. This is a sketch of his office on 3rd Street here in Philadelphia. Building is no longer there, but this is what it looked like back in the 1860s. Those images that I showed of Cooke, the one on the left we believe is from the Civil War. It's hard. Cooke's a fascinating character. I'd love to write a biography of him. There's essentially 2 of them, and the most recent one was about 100 years old at this point. But Cooke is mostly known for the Panic of 1873 and the railroad crisis. And so he gets kind of tainted with this legacy of kind of bringing down the world economy, which is not a great reputation to have. But that's all in the future. In the 1860s, he's a know-nothing banker. He's this nobody. No one knows who he is. And he's going to be the one who successfully sells these bonds. He's going to have ads in the newspapers, right? These 5, 20, 6% bonds, as I mentioned. You have to meet the people where they are. Guess what? Not everybody speaks English in the 1860s. So you have advertisements in German. You have them in Dutch. You have them in Swedish, right? If I showed you papers from places like Wisconsin and Iowa, there's Swedish ads, Norwegian ads, right? In an effort to try and reach people across as broad a swath as possible, They meet with such great success that the Treasury has to start hiring more people. We get our first female federal employees working for the Treasury Department. Naturally, this leads to a congressional investigation. The allegations are that the women are a distraction to the men at the Treasury. 8 months later, they determined that that is not, in fact, the case. And we can close this congressional investigation, all right? But I love this sketch because it's showing these, they really were some of the very first female federal employees. They worked in the office. They essentially processed all those coupons, those little coupons. I mean, it's incredibly sexist. It's like, you have very nimble fingers and that's gonna make you great for the job. But that's kind of, how they actually kind of phrase this. For this work, what really was kind of one of the most eye-opening components for me were ledger books. And this is an image of one, and it's the further you get away from it, the harder it is to see, I acknowledge, and the more we blow it up, the worse it gets. But these are ledger books that I came across at the National Archives. These are actually based at it's called National Archives 2, which is in College Park, Maryland. And they're for the Bureau of the Public Debt. And it gave me a window into who's actually buying these bonds. Because what I did is I looked at these volumes, there's over 700 of them. I looked at almost all of them. They're about 450 pages long. And I ran it against census data, looking at individuals to get a firmer sense of who some of these people are. Because Jay Cooke's all about messaging, hey, everyday people are buying these bonds. And I wanted to know if that was actually the case. Is that really the case? And the answer is, to a certain extent, yes, right? When I started to look at some of these people, I found German immigrants who own a boarding house buying a $50 bond. I find construction workers who have been able to cobble together $100 to buy a bond. It's not just kind of the wealthy elites who are buying these bonds. And so, to a certain degree, he's actually successful. What I actually did, and I'll spare you some of that data, this map actually shows in its modern day boundaries, but what it actually is showing is country of origin. So these are all people buying the bonds within the United States, but where did they actually emanate from originally? And this is just what I can confirm. I'm very confident, for instance, someone from Canada bought a bond within the United States. I just don't have concrete evidence, so I didn't include it in this map. But what you can actually see is there's quite a stretch here. All over the place. There's about $35 million worth that are purchased by Cuban immigrants in the greater New York City area, for instance. They are able to sell these kind of across a wide swath. We tend to think in the 19th century that the world at times is not that connected, and I think things like this kind of show just how connected it actually is with some of these immigrants buying these bonds. Now, of course, famous people buy these bonds. People like Abraham Lincoln buy these bonds. At least 36 members of Congress buy these bonds. P.T. Barnum buys a bond. Nathaniel Hawthorne buys a bond. Institutions buy these bonds, right? They're actually tax-free. Places you may have heard of, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Oberlin, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I don't have distinct proof that this institution purchased the bonds. I tried to find it, I really did, and I just couldn't, and it's really bothered me. But other institutions in town purchased these bonds as well. Brooks Brothers, they existed at the time. They actually made Civil War uniforms. They purchased bonds as well. And so Cooke is able to sell to a wide swath. They actually oversubscribed that $500 million bond issue. By the time they kind of closed the books, they finally realize that they've actually oversubscribed by about $15 million worth. I want to mention one other bond drive to you all. It's called the 730, and just to mix things up, it's called the 730 because it's a 7.3% interest rate. All right. These are issued after that 520 issue. Jay Cooke is actually originally not given the exclusive contract. The government thinks they've figured it out, and they can actually sell these, right? They've got the blueprint now from Cooke. They don't actually need to hire him. And what they actually find out is they desperately need to hire him because it's his network that they really need to rely on. And so Cooke is brought back into the fold ultimately. And with him, his several thousand traveling salesmen. And these are, really interesting folks. Some of them have a financial background. Some of them are just local community leaders, right? They want a trusted voice in given towns. They get an eighth of that 3/8, so they get a third of the commission, right? And they send reports back. And so we have a lot of these reports. The Jay Cooke papers are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania here. So they are a gold mine. They're amazing because there are all these reports that people send back, right? This one guy, Edward Sackett, is all over Wisconsin, and he writes about how he's going down into the mines and meeting with miners and convincing them about why they need to buy bonds. It's not rainbows and sprinkles for everyone. There are people who are in kind of heavily anti-Lincoln areas, and they really struggle to sell the bonds. There are people that end up in Missouri, which is like a civil war within the Civil War. That includes, I think, really interesting to note, Jay Cooke's brother. He gets assigned to go there. He lives here in Philadelphia with his wife, and Jay Cooke says, I need you to go to Missouri. I need you to go and sell the bonds there. He's brutally beaten and mugged and writes back and says, I need to come home, brother. I miss my wife, your sister, and I got beat up and they took all my money. And he says, I hear you, but you are doing the Lord's work there, so I need you to stay in Missouri, where he's promptly beat up and mugged a second time. So it gives me a window into how Jay Cooke feels about his brother-in-law. And so these agents are everywhere. They're on the West Coast. Some banks help along the way. There's a new bank out west called Wells Fargo at the time, and they're going to be essentially the primary California agent to sell these bonds and then report back their sales. And so just to give you a sense of how this works, the first series of the 730 bonds, the Treasury sold themselves, and it took them 170 days to sell the first issue. They bring Cooke back in, and in 55 days, he not only sells the next issue, he sells the next 2 issues worth, which is the same amount, right? This man is a machine. He's got this down and his network down in order to sell these bonds. Now, another thing that they're going to do, again, these are another example of some of the registers. There's just names upon names upon names. They're also going to open up night offices for the 730 loan issue, right? You got to meet people where they are. If you want to sell these bonds to people, some people don't work a conventional kind of 9-to-5 job. And so you're meeting people before they go on shift or they're coming off of shift for night work. Sit down, I'll give you some free coffee and donuts, maybe something stronger, right? And it's a timeshare. I want to sell you on an amazing opportunity. That's what these night offices are. This is an ad for kind of greater New York area for these night offices, Brooklyn and Manhattan, as well as over in New Jersey. And one of these offices on Bleecker Street in Lower Manhattan, one night they referenced the fact they sold to 27 shopkeepers, 19 machinists, boilermakers, foundrymen, 17 returned soldiers and sailors, 12 clerks and store attenders, 2 cabmen, 2 farmers, stall keepers, shoemakers, tailors, bookbinders, journalists. 13 were Irish, 16 were German, sold to a Portuguese, a Chinese, and a Moor. Right? These are the reports that are coming in, right? This is how they're able to sell these bonds. They also sell them to soldiers. Sometimes soldiers are actually paid in bonds when we don't actually have enough cash on hand. The government gives them bonds of equivalent. But some of these soldiers, right? One soldier said, if I fight hard enough, my bonds will be good. And at first I said, there is no way anyone actually said that, knowing Jay Cooke, right? And then I got into the archive and I found the original letter. And it was actually from a soldier, which was great, that it wasn't just Cooke saying that. Agent in Minnesota talked about that he was selling $1,000 a week to soldiers. 30,000 bonds were bought by the 5th Kentucky Cavalry, right? And we can go on and on. There's all sorts of soldiers who are buying these bonds. And it's when you get into those ledger, by the way, that you find some really interesting stories. And I just want to share one with you all. And that's a woman named Julia Cottle, C-O-T-T-L-E. Julia Cottle lived in New Orleans. She's born in Maine, but by the time of the Civil War, she's living in New Orleans. And New Orleans is actually somewhere where the Union Army is able to sell some bonds. And it doesn't surprise me, right? The Union Army moves in with the help of the Navy, of course. My father-in-law, the retired admiral, would probably kill me if I didn't mention the Navy. They're in there as early as April 1862. And what better way to demonstrate your loyalty to your new occupiers, right, than maybe buying a bond, right? Or maybe that's your deeply held sympathies. That's what you actually believe. But they actually sell them fairly well in New Orleans. And then I look at Julia Cottle, and Julia Cottle buys thousands of dollars worth of these bonds. And that made me very interested. So I look her up in the census, and it lists her as a washer. No way you're a washer and you're buying thousands of dollars worth of bonds in the 1860s. However, I look at later on in the ledger and I see that there are 23 women living at the same address between the ages of 18 and 22, roughly. I don't want to assume anything, so then I go to the newspapers and I go to the police reports, and it talks about busting a brothel. And so it's a little tongue-in-cheek to me, but I find it quite funny, right? She's washing money. She's laundering money. And so saying she's a washer is not too far off. But it's little stories like that it's just a name in a ledger with a number next to it in terms of what they purchased. But if you can go down some of these rabbit holes, which at times I do, I'm guilty of it, you find these really fascinating stories, I think, that shed a light into who some of these people were who bought the bonds. And there we go. The story doesn't end with Cooke. You know, Lincoln's assassinated towards the tail end of the war. Cooke actually goes to New York City, one of the few times he goes during the war, and is told, buy as many bonds as you need to stabilize the market there, right? We're trying to find someone who killed the president. And in the aftermath of the war, of course, there's the 1873 panic, and his legacy is somewhat tarnished. But this is actually an article from World War I, and it tells the story of Civil War finance, the sale of bonds during World War I, are actually modeled off of the Civil War. We don't talk about it that much, but they actually used it as a blueprint. Jay Cooke's grandson led kind of what was called the Crisis Club here in Philadelphia in order to sell the bonds during the war in 1917, 1918. And so these bonds are obviously sold at a very basic level. They fund the operation of the war, right? They pay for weapons, they pay for uniforms, they pay the $13 a month that a soldier would earn during the Civil War. But on a larger level, what these bonds also do is kind of speak to a larger moment in American financial history, and the idea that one of the key rights of citizenship is the right to invest if you really want to. And it gave that opportunity to Americans to buy into the Union cause. And they did, and in doing so, extended the sale of these bonds and securitized debt to a global community. You know, one thing I do want to at least briefly mention, normally I kind of linger on it a bit more, is the global nature of it. Of course, that's in the subtitle of the book because the algorithm said I had to have it. But the international sales of the war are crucial. I mean, I'm just going to bring up the map here. This is the one I was looking for. The sale of the bonds during the war and in the aftermath is extensive. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of the bonds are sold overseas during the war. But it's not the areas that you might expect. It's not London, it's not Paris. It's the Netherlands and the German states. Germany doesn't exist as a country yet. So we have the German states, and in particular Frankfurt. Frankfurt is ground zero for the sale of these bonds. During the war, of the $350 million worth of the bonds that are sold overseas, during the war, about $300 million worth are sold in the German states and the Netherlands. By 1869, 4 years after the war has ended, more than half of the US national debt is held overseas. That is abnormal for the time period. There's a concern about liability if you owe foreign players, right, the funds. But that's the nature of it, that these were bonds that were highly desirable all over the world. As you can see here, the government of Japan actually writes to Washington requesting bonds be written in Japanese script so they can sell them more easily, and the US government obliges. Even in countries like Switzerland, which is really hard for the US to kind of break into in the 1860s, we're still able to do that. I have one here. This is a Swiss bank. Shocker, they're a little hard to get into to look at the actual archives. This one I could get into because the bank no longer exists. But I did get into a couple other ones that still exist to this day. I just had to go through a lot of hoops, shall we say, to actually be able to look at some of the material. But this is a ledger book for a Swiss bank. And it's in French, but when you actually look at some of the more detailed records, it talks about how they have clients all over Europe. So we don't just want to look at these banks and don't think of them as very provincial and they're only dealing with, it's a British bank, so it must only deal with British clients or something like that. They have clients all over Europe and beyond. And so I'm happy to talk more about the international component, but the Netherlands, the German states, the French, all play a very important role on that international front. And it's an important role during the war because they actually are able to convince kind of everyday people abroad to buy these bonds. One of the most important people I will mention for the US effort abroad is essentially an ambassador. They don't call it at the time, but he's the ambassador in Frankfurt. He has no diplomatic experience, but he just hosts parties at his residence in Frankfurt and convinces people to buy bonds. He has shooting festivals in the countryside. First prize, you get a bond, right? He's doing things like that to convince people to actually buy these bonds. And so I didn't want to leave the stage here without at least mentioning some of that global dimension, and I'm happy to talk more about it further. And so I'm going to pause there. and take any of the questions you might have. So thank you.
Great. How about a big round of applause? Okay, questions? And if there is there are a couple of microphones, so.
6 and 7% versus the LIBOR of the day. What's the comparison?
So a kind of the staple debt issuance of the time is everybody looks at the British Consul, and it's about a 3% interest on those. I'm not implying that some of these people aren't buying these because of the possibility of pretty significant profit. There's also pretty significant inflation during the war as well, and that shouldn't be lost in all of this. But yeah, it's a higher interest rate, absolutely, relative to what you'd see out there for really it's mostly European countries.
Kristen?
Would you talk a little bit more about why somebody in Germany or the Netherlands would buy one of these?
Yeah. A big part of what they see in terms of the German motivation, and I've got, if you'll forgive me, kind of one quote here, because it's a great one. It gives you, it explains it all. This is from a German immigrant, right? Who says, "These bonds are the most powerful and influential emissaries you could have sent over to the old continent to convert the masses in Republican principles. They never before heard so much talk about America, your means and resources, your future and your prospects are discussed everywhere and in such favorable terms that emigration is the leading topic among the sturdy masses." If we were to dig deeper, right, there are revolutions all over Europe in 1848. And for a lot of Germans, they equate the Confederacy in the South with the aristocracy of Europe, right? Wealthy landowners suppressing, obviously in the United States, it's enslaved persons and other poor whites in the South. But they equate that with kind of the aristocracy back home that they dislike. And so you see a greater trend towards the anti-slavery movement within the German states in the late 1840s, 1850s. But if we were to look at Frankfurt area immigrants to the United States, German immigrants represent better part of about 40% of the people that are coming in the 1850s. And a lot of them are coming from the Frankfurt region. So the short answer is a lot of people are getting letters sent back to them that, hey, buy these, right? They're symbolic on one hand, but they're also incredibly profitable too. Netherlands is a little bit different story, yeah.
Can you contrast the south versus the north on the...
Sorry, I just heard a voice, so yeah.
Sorry. Can you contrast the south and the north versus the way they did the funding?
Absolutely, it's why I'm going to page 1, because I wrote this down after I got this question for I think the 6th time. Because it's a great question, right? Just to give you a sense, the short answer is it's kind of an inverse. The Confederacy prints a lot of money. So about 60% of the war for the Confederacy is financed just by printing money. They only have about 8% of the war financed through bonds. 8% through taxes, 32% through bonds, a third. They meet with great success at the beginning of the war, but as the war goes on, for the Confederacy, obviously, it's the war is slightly turning against them. And the issue is they start to accept things like cotton as payment, right? And so it's like sitting on docks, but it's not actually something that's really working for them. So it's a little bit different, but the short answer is printing money is kind of the primary means by which they fund their war, which their Secretary of the Treasury from day one says is going to be a disaster.
In the back here?
What was the common method of communication? How did they actually reach people in Europe and all over the world? There's no internet. I imagine sending letters took a long time. So how did they reach people and get them to buy these bonds?
So there's a great question. There is a transatlantic cable. The transatlantic cable breaks 2 years before the Civil War starts. It is not repaired until after the war ends. And so it may seem crazy, but really you had to get on a boat and go. It's about three weeks is a fast journey to go eastbound across the Atlantic. Maybe if you're really great, it could be something like 18 days. I think was the record. That's how they get the message across. And so any message they get obviously is weeks old at that point. You don't know what's happening from a military perspective, politically. And so, but that's the primary way that they get the message across. Jay Cooke is less interested, it's worth noting, in the foreign sales. That's not something that he sees as kind of a priority, which is really funny because after the Civil War ends and American banking houses are essentially allowed to open in London, Cooke is one of the first that actually will open a house abroad, put his name on it. But yeah, it's very old school in a sense. That's how you got the message across. And so it's one of the funnier things I got a chuckle out of was like reading Dutch and German newspapers, and they would have like ads in there that there were bonds that were missing. Right, this is the number of the bond. It was supposed to come to me because for the first half of the war, the government required a physical transfer of the bond. It had to be held in the recipient's hand, and then there's a treasury waiver so that essentially American banks can hold on to bonds for people who live abroad so that they don't have to do this, because they were like sending clerks overseas with like these huge chests of bonds, and like you didn't have the key to yours and things like it was ridiculous. And then a couple of them stole them and lived quite well in Europe. So they decided maybe we don't do that anymore. Yeah.
Back by Kira.
I was curious, when people bought the bond, so they hold them to maturity at all times, or was there any sort of secondary marker or way of transferring?
So
and
there
the prices
is,
fluctuate?
yeah, so the overwhelming majority of these bonds were coupon bonds, meaning that the government did not actually have to be informed of the transfer of ownership. Some of them are what we call registered bonds, and that's what they actually had to do. In the book, I actually traced a couple of bonds. I looked at the bond numbers, right? And I looked at different points when the interest coupons were turned in, it was marked, and like one of them changed hands like 7 times in the span of 3 years. Why, I don't know, right? But what I do know is that it did have that physical transfer. The reality is none of them really reached maturity because almost immediately after the war ends, speaking to the high interest rate, the government says, okay, we're going to refinance all these things, right? First batch goes down to 5%, then we have a bunch at 4.5%, then 4%, right? So they can call them in. The ones that they could call in earlier, they did. And those 520 ones, the day it hit 5 years, they're calling them in, right? And then they refinance it. Because sometimes I get asked, like, when did the US pay off the debt from the Civil War? And the answer is it's really hard to know because they refinance these things so many times. I settled on the early 1890s a while back, and I'm going to stick with that based on nerdy math that I did and ran it by my economist brother to make sure that I was, not, kind of in the right. But it's a ways down the line. There isn't some like ceremony or something announcing that we've paid off this debt.
John.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about Jay Cooke's claim to founding the Union League?
So Jay Cooke has a unpublished autobiography that he started and he does not finish before his death, just after the turn of the century. And then in a couple of letters from later in life, he also references the fact about how he would frequently come here during the war, like come meeting with other members during the war, and that he was one of the originals. He was one of kind of the initial group. He uses like vague language multiple times. He never actually says founding member. It's this kind, he's like, it's very weird. I don't know if, I'm putting a tinfoil hat on at this point and kind of looking into it, but he's a little cagey with it. But there's no indication that, that's actually the case. I fully believe that he's one of kind of close to the beginning, the initial members, given his role in the community here. He lived in Philadelphia at the time. He spends most of his time in Philadelphia, aside from summers in Ohio. Is it Lake Michigan? It's called Gibraltar. He had this massive compound that is now owned by the Ohio State University. And they use it for marine life stuff. I asked to go, and I'm still working on trying to get the invite there, because it's science-y, and that gets into a world that I am not familiar with. Yes.
So at a previous Civil War roundtable, one of the concepts or the ideas that was shared with us is that not everybody in Europe was rooting for the Union to prevail. What was, given the return, the tremendous financial return, was there also interest in this bond instrument amongst the aristocracy and stuff, or was it just purely the masses?
Yes. So, a couple of the banks that I have done a lot of research at in London, as well as in Paris, are the Rothschilds, and a lot of their clients are aristocracy at this time, and they are gobbling up these bonds. There's also Confederate bonds that are being floated in Europe. It's worth noting that the US government is never able to get a European bank to underwrite a bond issue. They try desperately. There's a bank just outside of Frankfurt. There's a town called Darmstadt, and it's called the Bank for Handel and Industry. And they try to get them to underwrite just a $10 million issue, and they balk. Whereas the Confederates get a French bank to underwrite a loan. I put an asterisk next to that because the French ambassador for the Confederate ambassador to Paris is marrying the daughter of the essentially president of this bank. And so I think he's doing a favor for his future son-in-law. And I know for a fact the same day that they float that Confederate bond issue in Frankfurt, he's buying the exact same amount in Union bonds. So I think it's just trying to be nice to his future son-in-law. But lastly, there's a big newspaper article in the Times of London, December 1865. That's like a tell-all. They reveal all the names of all the British aristocracy who bought Confederate bonds, right? And it includes like the prime minister, it includes all these people, members of the royal family, right? It's a big scandal by 19th century standards.
Right here.
You mentioned the cost of the Civil War equating to something like $7 trillion in today's dollars. Is that money expended by both the Union and the Confederacy?
That's just the Union side.
Just the Union. How much did the Confederacy spend?
Yeah, I was afraid of that.
Yeah.
It's less.
If you know.
I want to say it's something like the equivalent of like 4.1 trillion. It's still a tremendous amount.
Still a lot.
It's less, but it's still a tremendous amount.
Sorry, second question.
Yeah.
Pre-Emancipation Proclamation versus post-Emancipation Proclamation, what was the difference in the markets?
The market is softer pre-emancipation, I think in part because Jay Cooke's not brought on board until October 1862. So he's not in the picture really pre-Emancipation Proclamation. 1861, they are dead set on this model of just using banks to essentially fund the war. When they get into 1862, it's this fit and start, and it's not until the fall of 62 that Cooke is eventually brought on board. Members of Congress don't like this, right? He's investigated multiple times for improper gifts. He buys the Secretary of the Treasury a massive carriage for his daughter for their wedding. And he gets investigated, and the compromise is he has to give the carriage to the daughter versus giving it to the Secretary of the Treasury, and that makes it okay. But it's not just Democrats going after Cooke or Republican. There are Republicans who don't like Cooke because they've got friends in New York City who are getting iced out of all of this. They're saying, "Who is this guy down in Philadelphia? Right? What's he done to deserve this?"
Right here in the second row.
What was it like to finance wars throughout the world just then? Because you mentioned Napoleon had done something, made this. And were those governments issuing bonds, or were they just getting wealthy people, their own aristocracy, to just lend them money? Because this somehow makes it more granular to end up with little units like that, as opposed to $1 million. You lend me $1 million. And secondly, were they doing any financing for non-war, say, to build a railroad or
Yeah.
to build a new port, something like that?
Yeah, great questions. So that, for the first one, I mean, really, when you look at places like France and Austria is another great example, they rely on the people. And this is, they view this as a morale issue, that this is a way to get people to buy into this thing. And so, yeah, it's nice to have wealthy friends who might be able to chip in some funds, but to get the public invested in this way, literally, is a totally different kind of entity. And Cooke is obsessed with this. He has scrapbooks where he from the 1850s. So he's been thinking about this. It's not like the Civil War happens and he's like, oh, I now have an idea. It's been percolating for a while. In terms of the second question, in terms of kind of non-war finance, absolutely. So not to toot my own horn, my next book is looking at 1840s US states and how a lot of them, including this one right here, Pennsylvania, issue a lot of debt in order to do things like finance internal improvements. My story talks about when all these states say they no longer want to honor the debt, and it leads to a transatlantic financial crisis. And so people have to be blackmailed and things like that. So that's coming down the pike. It's fun stuff. But Pennsylvania was the single largest state debt issuer of any state in the Union before the Civil War. Tens of millions of dollars worth.
We've got a question right here, and then our last one will be right there.
So if the Union was at 6% and 7.3, what were the Confederate bonds giving?
The peak, I think, was 6, actually. Most of them initially are 4.5 to 5. They're viewed as a less risky investment in 1861. Believe it or not. As the seceding contingent of the country, it's viewed as a more stable investment.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. How long did your research take?
That's a great question. I spent 4 months here in 2014. The book came out 2 years ago this Friday, so let's put it in perspective. It didn't just come out, right? It came out 2 years ago this Friday, but off and on, because I also teach, things like that. There are other things going on. 5 years. I rewrote the book twice. Didn't like parts of it. So, yeah, there was also that too. But it's a process. It's a labor of love. And but I just found that there's so little written about it, and there are so many stories, and I didn't get into all the characters. There's just so many characters that don't feature otherwise in the war. And it's nice to get some of those voices out there and to share them.
We are at time, so how about a big hand for Professor Thomson? Are you able to stick around and sign a few more books? So anyone who wants to still purchase a book, David will be happy to sign. May 6th, May 30th, please make sure you sign up for those programs. Thank you for being here tonight. Have a lovely evening.
They're all archives. They're just different places that I've gone. That's from an archival system. So that's a high res, but like I